50 years ago, in a tiny bar called the Stonewall Inn, LGBTQ people fought back against years of oppression. Today, this history lives on around the world. It lives in moments big
This is who I am.
and small, in voices old and new.
I'm a queer person. I am so powerful.
The story of America is a story of progress. Sometimes we can mark that progress in special places. One of these special places is the Stonewall Inn.
The first national monument dedicated to the story of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community and their fight for equal rights.
New York City's LGBT Community Center, with support from the National Parks Service and Google, is working to preserve this story and bring it to as many people as possible, taking the idea of a national monument and bringing it to life. By digitizing archival materials from the early years of the movement, by capturing the voices at the front of the fight,
It felt like you were free. You didn't have to hide anymore.
by finding voices we've yet to hear and bringing them all together in a living monument.
We're gonna stand up and take our own rights into our own hands.
Stonewall made us a people. We all knew it was different now.
For everyone, everywhere, where we all can see the history and add our own.
There are some places that move us, inspire us, and forever change us. Stonewall National Monument is one such place. But the struggle for LGBTQ equal rights started well before Stonewall and included peaceful protests. Then, on June 28, 1969, after decades of discrimination, the LGBTQ community fought back. The week-long uprising at Stonewall Inn and Christopher Park launched a global movement demanding equal rights for all, where Black transgender and queer activists played a pivotal role. Their determination, along with Stonewall's location within Greenwich Village's labyrinth-like streets and the local LGBTQ homeless youth spontaneously helping protesters escape, forever changed history. News traveled around the world, and today, annual Pride celebrations honor these events. Stonewall continues to inspire generations, from our history to representing landmark progress like marriage equality and workers' rights. Building on NPCA's work to preserve the Stonewall story and all it stands for within the national park system, we're engaging young, diverse people about the significance of this place and hope they may see themselves within the stories represented by our parks. This work is centered around Stonewall, but must expand to include more. Join us as we continue to fight for a more inclusive, diverse national park system for all.
This is a special edition of Your Path with Bishop Mark from Dallas Universal Life Church in Dallas, Texas. And now, Bishop Mark.
I'll tell you this, the title of our sermon this afternoon is Honor and Shame. And if you've noticed, we do have a few things different in the sanctuary today. So we've got the pride flag here. It's not Pride in Dallas this week. It's kind of confusing. Dallas changed their pride to June last year. Well, this year we thought they were going to get to do it again, but they moved it to July because of the COVID-19. But they're not going to be able to do it again, so it's just going to be virtual in July. So that's kind of messed up. It's kind of confusing, and we'll get through it. But June is Gay Pride Month, is Gay History Month. And this weekend, today, is the 51st anniversary of the Stonewall riots. So we're going to discuss a little bit of that today and maybe learn some things. Okay? So I say good afternoon to you. You can say good afternoon back. It's okay. There you go. In a lower Manhattan neighborhood that doesn't stand out necessarily from any of the other hundreds of neighborhoods in the mega metropolis known as New York City, stands the Stonewall Inn, now a national landmark, along with Christopher Park, set aside by the National Park Service in its dedication as a national monument on June the 24th, 1 year ago. Those timely and overdue monuments are marks of distinction, matters of pride that were hard won. The Stonewall Inn was a bar where gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered people gathered. Unlike a few of the other bars in the village at the time that appealed to a more upscale sweater and slacks crowd, the Stonewall Inn took in the tired, the poor, the huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of the teeming shore of the lower part of Manhattan. The Stonewall's clientele were drag queens, transgendered persons, male hustlers, homeless youth, butch lesbians, and gay folk on the fringe. And if we believe what the Bible tells us about the company Jesus kept, they were not so different from the types whom Jesus seemed to consort in his lifetime. Or so the accusations of those who disliked Jesus went. Prostitutes, tax collectors, sinners, the wretched refuse of the Judean teeming shore. But there was a price to be paid by the Stonewall for the sanctuary it offered to people that no one else wanted. The Stonewall Inn was subject to the indignity of police raids on a regular basis. The mafia, who owned the bar, paid the police to keep away so they could overcharge and often extort from their patrons. But every now and then, just for the fun of it and for the sake of appearances, New York's finest would raid the Stonewall, trotting out its outrageous clientele, cracking a few heads, handcuffing these clearly shameful social misfits, and load them into paddy wagons, book them at central booking, and fine them for their supposedly lewd and lascivious behavior, sometimes publishing their names in the newspapers as to jeopardize their employment and embarrass their families. But in the early hours of June the 28th, 1969, a group of drag queens and Stonewall regulars fought back against the police who showed up for the raid that night. It was to have been a routine evening of rounding up the usual suspects, but it turned out to be a bottle-throwing, fist-hammering melee in which reinforcements from the police had to be brought in to handle the out-of-control crowd. The normally docile gay and lesbian drag queens rose up ferociously and said, "No more." It was the beginning of what would be years of struggle, decades of demonstrations, a movement that would usher in the breakdown and reconfiguration of sexual mores and behaviors in this country, become an ally to the rise of feminism, and cause citizens to explore aspects of our humanity and sexuality about which we had never spoken so openly, whether it be straight, gay, or some variation on that theme. 1969 was the same summer as Woodstock and the Beatles and tie-dye shirts. It was a decade of Vietnam and Richard Nixon and questioning authority. 1969, with all its upheaval, would be the last year that any major mainline denomination in this country would show membership gains. Every year since, most denominations have lost membership. The mainline Protestant church in America began to experience the same changes that have not stopped, changes that continue to mark our ongoing evolution as a society, a nation, and Christian churches. Women began to be ordained as ministers in 1956 in some denominations, but we are still struggling after 60 years to fully welcome the gifts of women in ministry. Even so, without the struggle to overcome men's and women's strong opposition to women's ordination, in clear violation of Paul's teaching to the Corinthian believers that women should be silent in church. First of all, I am not sure the gay liberation movement would have had the model for an ongoing revelation in Scripture that eventually led us to explore and understand, in broader terms, Paul's teachings about homosexuality. In other words, if they hadn't gone through it first and taught us how to go through the revolution, we may not have known how to do it. So kudos to them. Interestingly enough, Jesus said not a single word, not one single word about homosexuality. In all of his recorded encounters and sayings, not one word. He did heal the servant of a centurion in Capernaum, whom Luke tells us the centurion valued highly. And there is scholarly discussion on the possibility that the servant was the centurion's paideia, the Greek manner of tutelage, which included sexual expression. It's notable that the centurion says to Jesus, "I am not worthy for you to come into my house, but only say the word, and my servant will be healed." If Jesus brought healing to such as these, then we have welcome and teachings by example that speaks as eloquently as could words that were never said. The Presbyterian Church spent almost 40 years deciding to ordain gay and lesbian persons to the ministries of the church. It began in 1975, when the question first raised as to whether the New York City Presbytery would be willing to ordain into the ministry a self-affirming gay man. Presbyterians argued year after year at General Assemblies about sexuality and ordination, and for those 40 years spoke of little else. All those years they worked to get the Presbyterian Church to acknowledge officially what it had already always known privately, that some of their more gifted, able, and faithful ministers, elders, and deacons were already serving in the ministries of the church, closeted and unable to affirm their whole selves for fear that the church would expel them or try them in ecclesial courts and rule them in violation of the standards of the church, which I hope you will forgive my saying were simply wrong. They spent 40 years as a denomination finding the way to embrace that truth, that God had not excluded from ministry those who loved someone of the same gender. But of course, the church had. Not until 6 years ago did the Presbyterian Church finally declare that truth and embrace that fact. We all still have a long way to go, but the very fact that they have come this far is remarkable. It is sad that a generation or two of the church has paid such a painful price to be able to simply tell the truth. And it did so in a period when a whole generation of gay men who needed their churches and sought to lean on their faith as they suffered and died of AIDS found that they would only be welcome to the church again in a casket, if at all. Which brings me to offer a thought or two about shame and honor and pride on this, the 51st anniversary of Stonewall, and the celebration of World Pride being celebrated for the first time virtually all over the world. In a pre-pandemic world, St. Patrick's was one of the few churches in the city that would offer a welcome to the marchers from a position on Fifth Avenue on the parade route in Greenwich Village, of all places, and offer a cup of water to thirsty revelers and proud marchers who were dancing in the streets in no less a joyful mood than King David that day he danced half naked into Jerusalem and embarrassed his wife, who felt humiliated that David had danced with such enthusiasm and abandon in his linen ephod, the equivalent of his Calvins, that Michael despised the sight of him for his embarrassing her. Things were never the same again for them after that pride parade. In the time of Jesus, there was a different understanding of honor and shame than today, and the explanation falls very strange on our contemporary ears. Bruce Molina, a cultural anthropologist and theologian, defines the ancient understanding of honor and shame in this way. Honor is the value of a person in his or her own eyes, plus that person's value in the eyes of his or her social group. Pretty deep, huh? Honor is both the claim to self-worth and the social acknowledgement of worth. In the ancient world, honor was ascribed to a person on the basis of a number of social markers, not the least of which were the roles ascribed to sexuality. Men had certain roles to play, certain responsibilities to fulfill, certain privileges attending the position of a man, a husband, a father in society. Shame, on the other hand, was also a quality in the ancient world that defined worth in social interactions. A shameless person was one who defied the rules of appropriate mores and interactions, and these definitions of honor and shame were lived out in the way men and women interacted in the family, in the village, and in the city. In the ancient world's understanding, there were limited quantities of honor and shame, which were kept in balance in offsetting categories by carefully assigned transactions. There was an equal balance of shame and honor in life, and your goal was to maintain more honor than shame. It's a dynamic that we can still see in modern terms in the Middle East today. If a woman would fall in love with someone not of her religious grouping, or heaven forbid, she was found to be having a romantic encounter with a man who was not her husband, the shame of the woman in violating the rules of honorable behavior would confer shame upon the whole family. So in rare and disturbing circumstances, even today, we hear of brothers who stoned to death a sister who has brought shame upon the family name. In northern Mali, in the very recent past, a couple was stoned to death for living in violation of Islamic law by living together without benefit of marriage. And in Mosul, in just a couple of years ago, a man was thrown off a roof, and some of you remember this, thrown off a roof and then stoned to death for being gay. A violation of Islamic law. It was gruesome. Gruesome to watch. God rest his soul. In John's Gospel, we read the story of a woman taken in adultery who throws herself at Jesus' feet, surrounded by the men who have chased her down and are prepared to stone her to death. But Jesus turns the entire honor and shame dynamic on its head when he tells the men that only those who have not sinned may cast the first stone. How like Jesus to single out the one person most vulnerable and endangered, considered to be the most scandalous, and reverse what was her shame to become her common lot with the men who were her accusers. Her shame became the honor conferred on her by Jesus protecting her. We see this reversing of roles by Jesus again and again in the Gospels. Take, for instance, Jesus' conversation with the woman at a well in Samaria, a woman to whom no one else would speak, and whom even the disciples were startled to see Jesus speaking in the broad light of noonday. We see it in Jesus' words to the thief, whom he blesses as he is dying on the cross. Today you will be with me in paradise, he says to a man who was dying beside him for wrongdoing, reversing the shame with a blessing, the promise of being with Jesus in paradise. We see it when Jesus tells a parable about a prodigal son who shames his family by running off with a portion of his father's estate, dishonoring his mother and father, and mocking the faithfulness of his older brother. Jesus' interactions with people made them see the good in themselves and never left them powerless, vulnerable, or in danger. He found and lifted up what is honorable in others and left no one in shame. If anything, it was more his way to take the shame of others to himself, and in so doing to restore their honor. Now, how many of you here this afternoon identify yourselves as queer? It's still a pretty tough word in the South here. Queer, when I was growing up, was what you called other boys in 7th grade who were not jocks, who were self-conscious or small or liked to play chess or possessed any quality that made them different, and which had almost nothing to do with sexuality and everything to do with the power. The power to make another person feel inferior or not fit in or less than normal, whatever normal was. Today, 7th graders still use that word, and it's meant as it means basically the same thing as it did when I was in 7th grade. I would say, incidentally, that almost every kid spent a lot of every day trying to make sure that they did not do anything that warranted the cool kids calling you gay. I think I made it all the way through 7th. It might have been just 6th grade, but one of the two without being called gay, which was ironic considering that would gladly not prove to be the case. But queer as a word has been redeemed from the garbage, washed off and repainted, given new wheels and made presentable again. And what I What I learned is that there is a sense in which all sexuality is a bit queer. Our bare bodies with all the bumps and juts and dents and scars, our flabbiness and love handles, and awkwardness of being unclothed, and differentness of our shapes and sizes, the person we only see in the mirror briefly, queer and aging and so different than we used to look. Standing there in the mirror with life's battle scars and our excesses showing. And ever since the garden, when the first naked human beings suddenly discovered being naked, which hadn't even crossed their minds before, discovered how queer is God's sense of humor to make us all so alike, and yet so different. If sex may be romantic and lovely and gentle and expressive and tender, but it can also be funny and awkward and strangely balanced and oddly maneuvered and even boring. Queer. Which is in a strange way what Paul was getting at in his first letter to the Corinthians. All that convoluted language about the delight God took in making us all a symphony of body parts when God created us to be who we are. Can't be all nose, because what would be the point of that, implied Paul? Where would be the sense of touch? Can't be all eye, he said, or where would be the sense of smell? And then very specifically he says, the members of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. And those members of the body that we think less honorable, we clothe with greater honor. And our less respectable members are treated with greater respect. Whereas our more respectable members do not need this. But God has so arranged the body, giving the greater honor to the inferior member, that there may be no dissension within the body, but the members may have the same care for one another. Interesting analogy. Paul Sampley, a Pauline scholar, says that Paul is addressing the issue in the Corinthian church of low self-esteem and vaulted self-esteem. And his way of doing so has to do with celebrating the body, talking about how every part of the body is important and essential to the rest of the body. All the parts have to work together, and we should not deem some parts as more honorable or less honorable than others. All the parts work together to bring honor and function to the whole body, because the head of the body is Jesus Christ. In other words, that we may deem our more shameful parts are still essential parts, and what we adorn and dress up and paint and tattoo and show off with delight is every bit as valuable to the whole body as the less presentable parts. That's not a bad lesson in anatomy. And theologically speaking, it's the key understanding to a healthy church. It's World Pride Sunday, a good day to remember that God made the creation and all that is in it. Fully human in all our diversity, and every living thing God called good. So give thanks this day for being in God's eyes good, queer as we all are, different and alike as we all are, presentable and unpresentable as we all are. God's joy and delight, just the way we are. Thanks be to God. Amen.